While most UFO sightings involve witnesses seeing a strange light, a disc, a triangle, there are some cases that go far beyond just seeing an unidentified object. There are many documented cases that involve seeing the occupants of that UFO, beings, humanoids. Some witnesses claim aliens.
Did you see the eyes? What did they look like?
They were green like that.
Today we will look at historical evidence of close encounters of the third kind. Welcome to the Basement Office. So obviously, Nick, when people hear Close Encounters of the Third Kind, they think the Spielberg movie, right?
Yeah. Have you recently had a close encounter? Who are you people?
Where does the Close Encounters of the Third Kind come from?
It comes from Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was Project Bluebook's scientific consultant. And he basically split UFO sightings into three categories. Close encounter of the first kind is the sighting of a UFO. Close encounter of the second kind is where a UFO has some sort of interaction with the environment that might be, just it rustles the treetops or it
Leaves markings.
leave
in the
markings
ground,
or
right?
something secondary in terms of evidence. It takes it above just a story. Close encounter of the third kind is a sighting where entities are seen in association with the UFO.
Right. Two things to point out. Entities don't necessarily mean alien, and UFO doesn't necessarily mean alien. Unidentified is it. So you see an unidentified flying object, and you see unidentified beings. Entities, humans, you don't know who or what they are. We've handpicked some of the best, in my opinion, documented cases of close encounters of the third kind. And the first, kind of chronologically, really is in Aurora, Texas in 1897, quite a while ago. What do you know about this case?
Well, 50 years before Roswell, 1947, New Mexico, it was alleged that something unknown, an object, a UFO, whatever we call it, crashed in Aurora, Texas, and bizarrely, in amongst all the reports that came in from the area, and we have lots and lots of newspaper clippings and coverage of this, but part of the story was that an entity, an alien, call it what you will, was found and actually buried in the local churchyard.
Mm-hmm. The printed news cases here reads almost like a science fiction mini short story. The story of a downed craft and a body, the occupant of whatever crashed, was recovered. And the story goes that this occupant, pilot of this downed UFO, was buried by townsfolk in the local cemetery. And you would think, okay, let's prove this once and for all. If there is an alien buried underground in a cemetery, let's just dig it up and see what's there. But in the 1970s, multiple requests to exhume that body were denied.
But then in 2008, they did actually get access, and they were able to use ground-penetrating radar to search the area. They did find some unmarked grave separate from the others, and they had a look. Now, unfortunately, it had deteriorated over the years such a lot that the results were inconclusive, but it was there. Something was there. I'm not saying it was alien, but there was an unmarked grave.
Now, interestingly enough, pieces of metal allegedly were collected from the crash site and were analyzed, and there are photos. MUFON, Mutual UFO Network, acquired these metals many years later using metal detectors. on the property where the crash happened. Now here are some of the pictures and scans of these metals. What am I looking at essentially?
Well, you're looking at what might, if the believers are correct, be a smoking gun. Because again, with something like this, it's testable in a proper, empirical, repeatable, scientific way.
And tests were indeed done. MUFON sent the samples to various experts throughout the country. They found that the debris had many examples, physical examples, that an explosion had occurred. Analysis of the metal itself found mostly aluminum and iron, but they found strange things such as a lack of copper. And this was considered an anomaly because most commercial aluminum that contains iron also contains copper, and they found none. They also discovered several alloys here that remain unidentified. Now, a press release put out by physics professor Dr. Tom Gray of North Texas State University, based on his own independent analysis, called the metal debris, quote, puzzling. So while there is some documented evidence that something crashed, something did happen, there is no conclusive evidence that it was alien and that a dead extraterrestrial body is buried in the ground in Aurora. What's your take on this?
Either, as the skeptics say, this whole Aurora crash story was made up. There is a theory that the town got bypassed by the railroad and they needed something to make them attraction.
Yeah,
So
needed tourism. Yeah.
either it's that or it's the real thing.
Okay, so moving on to a case that is well documented, reliable witness, and a great story, in my opinion, is the Lonnie Zamora case in New Mexico, 1964. We set up the scene here of Zamora's close encounter of the third kind.
Well, he's a police officer and hears this strange roaring sound. And at first he thinks a shack full of dynamite must have blown up or something like that. And then he looks up and he sees this object and he's kind of radioing this in and wondering if anyone else is seeing it. And then, a short while later, he comes across an object on the ground, a kind of oval-shaped, egg-shaped, dare I say, tic-tac shaped, yeah. And this thing is like resting on the ground on legs, on some sort of landing gear. But even more bizarrely, there are two figures that he sees. Two short figures, essentially humanoid, but he can't really quite make them out. They seem to be dressed in some sort of white overalls.
Right, like the size that he describes were the size of children.
Yes. And basically they get back in and this thing takes off and shoots off to the horizon.
Right. And now, there's a lot of documentation here. I mean, this is Zamora's sketch. So, roughly this is what he says the craft looked like. And then this is an artist's impression of that sketch with the beings that he saw next to it. Now, first on the scene was the New Mexico State Police, who gathered evidence, filed reports. Next on the scene was the U.S. Air Force and Project Blue Book, and then eventually the FBI. It's unclear why the FBI shows up. No one knew why the FBI showed up. In fact, the FBI told everyone there to keep their presence there a secret and to keep it quiet. So, okay, evidence is gathered, evidence is observed, broken branches, burn marks, impressions in the ground, all evidence of something actually being there. You can see the people in this photo, so you can judge the size of how big that object was, where the impressions are in the ground here. Here, at the scene of the investigation, they found fused sand, I believe, where when you expose sand to high temperatures, it becomes glass, essentially. And
Yes.
I think they found evidence here of that.
This
Now-
is real, tangible, physical evidence that something anomalous was interacting with the environment.
Right.
When you've got all those things at once, the eyewitness testimony, but the physical evidence too, then, as I've said before, it elevates this above the level of simply a story, and it becomes something provable.
Right. Has there been any indication as to what the marking, the very unique marking he says was on the side of this thing?
No, when you look at something like that, you would think, well, look, if this was ours, I mean, and there are some theories doing the rounds that this was maybe some sort of prototype lunar landing module being tested. Well, then it would have, like, the United States Air Force or NASA or there would be some discernible symbol or wording on the sides. But this is completely abstract, and it poses the question, if this is not our language or symbol, what is it?
Yeah, I agree that if this belonged to the Air Force or NASA, you would see the U.S. Air Force symbol, the NASA symbol, or at least an American flag, because those symbols are indeed all over American aircraft. And per Zamora's testimony, all we have is this weird arrow symbol. But this occurred in 1964, in the middle of the space race, the race to go to the moon, the race to go to space. So moving away from this arrow symbol, I think that because of the location where this happened and the size and shape of this object provides a good case that what Zamora saw was potentially a lunar landing module or a experimental version of that being tested. If you look at the various lunar modules that they actually used, I could see this being perhaps a prototype. This is in New Mexico, where tons of testing grounds. The Army, Air Force, etc. Here in the deserts, they were blowing up nukes, testing grounds for many weapons. Perhaps they were testing a lunar module, something that was small, and so they needed small humans in order to fit inside of it. The capacity, weight, and height to fit inside this thing is a certain amount. They needed shorter individuals to pilot this thing. So there's nothing about this that says alien.
Well, let me throw a curveball into this story. Army Captain Richard Holder is the senior officer at White Sands Testing Range. Now, this is a facility, it's where the largest testing facility in the United States. It's where the first atomic bomb was tested. And he actually went to the location of the sighting afterwards. He interviewed Zamora, and Zamora himself brought up this possibility. Well, could it be that I actually saw something, military kit being tested? And Holder said, no. He said, we currently have no craft that looked like that, and we were not running any tests that day. And Dr. J. Allen Hynek from Project Blue Book specifically and definitively ruled out that Zamora saw either a lunar landing module or excursion vehicle.
I'd like to end by reading a quote from a secret report, Project Blue Book report, prepared for the CIA. Project Blue Book's director, Major Hector Quintanilla, said, "There is no doubt that Lonnie Zamora saw an object which left quite an impression on him. There is no question about Zamora's reliability. He is a serious police officer, a pillar of his church, and a man well versed in recognizing airborne vehicles in his area. He is puzzled by what he saw, and frankly, so are we. This is the best documented case on record, and we still have been unable, in spite of thorough investigation, to find the vehicle or other stimulus that scared Zamora to the point of panic." Now I want to jump over the next year after this case right here, which is well documented, in France in 1965. A year later, a farmer in Valençon, France. 5:45, he gets up in the morning to go to work. The sun is barely breaking. He sees what Zamora described, which is this white, round tic-tac looking object in his backyard, and also sees 2 occupants.
And just like Zamora, he describes these 2 figures as being short, not quite 4 feet tall, like children, dressed in a tight grey-green outfit of some description, disproportionately large heads, huge slanted eyes, and he said they were making a sort of grumbling sound.
He claims in the police report and in the reports out of France, he says that when he slowly approached this object thinking it was a helicopter, one of the occupants pointed something at him, and he said he felt like he was having a stroke, couldn't move, he was paralyzed, he couldn't move. The occupants, like in the Zamora case, he claims got into the craft and took off vertically again, leaving a lot of evidence on the ground, physical evidence on the ground. The local police show up to investigate. The national police, which is like a branch of the military in France, show up to investigate. And then GPAN, which is a unit within the French space agency, basically their version of NASA, shows up to investigate, collect evidence and data. What else is there about this case that sticks out to you?
Well, again, it's the physical evidence that corroborates just the eyewitness testimony, and they, after this incident was reported, they went to the landing site, and sure enough, when they looked at the soil, they found higher levels of calcium than would be normal, and higher levels than the surrounding area. I mean, this was a lavender field, and they found what appeared to be cellular changes at the cellular level in some of these plants. And again, that gives you something testable. This is something that you can, and they did, take to a laboratory, analyze.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can see right here. I mean, the photos, these are on-site photos of investigators of impressions in the ground. And here are the arrows pointing at the different impressions in the ground. It's very similar to the size and spacing of the Zamora case. And again, that outlying factor, that curveball, are the occupants.
Yes, and in intelligence work, one of the questions you always ask is there corroboration from an independent source of this information? And when they showed the farmer a sketch of Lonnie Zamora's UFO, it was like he was shocked, and he said somebody else has seen my UFO.
He was relieved. Also, because he it was an investigator who had a report of the Zamora case, and he was almost relieved. Oh, thank God I'm not crazy. You know, like, he pointed to a literal sketch of Zamora's and said, that's it. And I'm so happy someone else saw it, because I thought I was crazy.
These people were unaware of each other. They didn't know each other's stories. It was only the investigators who made the connection and thought, let's see what happens.
Right.
And as I say, that's corroboration from an independent source that seems to validate it. And the other important thing is, of course, if you go back to the speculation, well, could this be the US government testing some lunar lander module, something like that? Well, not in a lavender field in France.
Some random farm in France, exactly. No. It should be noted that investigations by official and civilian agencies confirmed the farmer's sincerity and good character. All right, let's move on to, wow, this case. Oh my gosh. I just couldn't, I had to read through this 3 times because it's so awesome. Okay, so the Canary Islands in 1976.
Yeah, this is June 22nd, 1976. Hundreds, thousands of witnesses from all around the Canary Islands seeing this huge UFO.
A photo was taken. When you read the testimonies about this orb, this object, what everyone seems to agree on across the board, whether it be the naval officers in the boat, whether it be the taxi cab driver, whether it be the physician at a patient's house who observed this, is that this orb was huge. In the official Spanish military reports, witnesses say the size of the orb was originally seen as about 3 times the size of a full moon. But then, quote, the sphere began to grow and grow until it became huge, like a 20-story building. And as you can see in this second photo, by looking at the buildings in the foreground, this thing is massive. Witnesses then say the orb suddenly took off at a, quote, breakneck speed and disappeared. What everyone also agrees upon is when the orb disappeared, when this centerpiece disappeared, the ring remained. For a while, it hovered in the air, just this ring. Now, this may seem like a close encounter of the first or second kind. How does this case transfer into a third kind encounter?
It comes with the physician's report. This physician who was visiting a house of a patient, and he encountered, one assumes, this very object basically hovering over the road, and he said this was vast. And then when he looked up, he was able to discern inside this craft occupants.
In the official report from the Spanish government about this incident, the doctor is thoroughly interviewed. He and the taxi driver are driving along. They see this giant orb. He asks the taxi driver, are you seeing what I'm seeing? And then when they get closer to it, he exclaims, my God, what is that? He says he could see through the orb as if it was transparent. He could see the stars. And inside the orb, he sees 2 figures. And he wasn't alone. A couple from the window of their house, a teacher, a police officer, a farmer. They all see 2 figures inside this giant orb. And their descriptions of these entities all match up. 2 occupants, I believe he said, dressed in red. 3 control panels, and then a tall, almost tower of sorts within the orb. If this is us, if this is a government experiment, if this is top secret military tech, what are they doing messing around in some random town in the Canary Islands? It's not. There are plenty isolated places across this planet, deserts where no one's gonna see you. You know, why go where there's high population? So to me, it doesn't make sense. If this is some human experimental thing, it doesn't make sense for them to be going here. Now, the leap to there were occupants that aren't human on board, you can't prove that, but you have more than one witness saying they saw something. So they saw something. They believe they saw occupants.
What's really, I think, extraordinary about this is the level of documentation we have from the Spanish government. The Air Force launched a full, detailed inquiry into this. And again, this is so important when we talk about these cases. Where you've got that government archive of documents that you can say, well, look, here's what the Air Force came up with. And they launched this inquiry. They took witness statements. They were so meticulous with this. They split the witnesses into different categories according to their reliability. So, for example, into the highest category of reliability went pilots, aeronautical engineers, then police officers, physicians, and you know, they would give a lot of weighting to those sightings. But this is essentially the Spanish Air Force concluding that, look, there's no smoke without fire. Something happened here, and something extraordinary.
And the Spanish military, after an exhaustive investigation, came to this conclusion, quote, the analyzed phenomena really occurred on the night of June 22nd, 1976. Its nature is completely unknown. The final conclusion is reached that the object observed was an unidentified aerial phenomenon. So this one right here is another head scratcher. On September 16th, 1994, at the Ariel Primary School in Zimbabwe, 60 school children on recess outside claim to have seen a disc-shaped object land behind the school, and 2 occupants, like the Zamora case, like the French case, 2 occupants next to the craft approach the children. Are you familiar with this?
Well, this is extraordinary, and this is a mass sighting by any definition. Multiple witnesses, and this was a case that came to the attention of a very heavyweight academic figure, Dr. John Mack, professor of psychiatry, Harvard Medical School. He heard about this. He flew out there. He interviewed a lot of the children.
What did it feel like when he was looking at you?
I felt scared. I felt scared because I've never seen such a person like that before.
And he was convinced that this case was real and that what they said happened actually did happen.
As far as one can tell, these people are talking about something the way a normal person talks about something that has happened to them, except for one problem, that according to our worldview, it's not possible.
And a new documentary film called The Aerial Phenomenon has uncovered the original video interviews of the children by Dr. John Mack.
I know this is hard. I know it's hard.
And what's fascinating is they're not in a group. He does them one by one. One by one, what did you see? What did it look like? What color? How tall? And these are young kids, and they all are consistent. It's all consistent. It's not like one saying, well, it had 5 heads and stuff like that, and they're so different, the stories. They're all the same story. And when they're asked to draw, they collected sketches and drawings from these kids about the craft.
Looks like a tic-tac.
It does. Well, in many ways, this right here, which the students all agree was a thing that was in their schoolyard, it's a white thing like the Zamora case, like the French case. Here's a sketch of one of the children did of the occupant. Another one who says there were 2. And the core of this case is a thing came out of the sky and landed. Okay, that's not really a dispute. Everyone there says that happened. People, humanoids, entities, whatever, came out of the craft. Something came out of the craft. Everyone, just like the Zamora case and the French case, everyone seems to kind of agree that happened. Now, where it gets weird is they say they were spoken to.
How did those thoughts come to you? Did they come to you from the craft or from
From the man.
the man?
Some of the children believed that they had been given messages somehow, the communication, maybe telepathic. The other point about all this is that these children, I mean, they stick to their story. I mean, 25 years on.
People need to know there is something else out there.
It had a deep and profound effect upon them, and still does. You can't, in this subject, ignore the data just because they don't fit your preconceived ideas. You have to say, okay, if this is what people are reporting, what did they see? What does it mean?
In the courts, in the actual justice system, if you had a child or a couple children out playing and there was a crime committed and the police interviewed them separately, what did you see? And they all described the same thing, that would be used as evidence, admittable evidence in a case that could possibly convict and prove without a shadow of a doubt that something happened. Here you've got dozens of cases like that. Dozens of saying the same thing happened, yet this story is so, in my opinion, underreported.
It's almost like it's so far out that even the UFO believers think, you know what, it's safest just to stick to the pilots and the radar operators. This one, let's not go big on this because it's too much of a gift to the skeptics.
Okay, so you mentioned skeptics, right? And a skeptic might look at this case and say, it's just a bunch of scared, confused children. That it might be a case of mass hysteria. And mass hysteria is a real phenomenon, psychological phenomenon brought on by, in a group setting, brought on by fear and rumor, and it's observable. There are many cases of actual real mass hysteria throughout history. But there is a study that was published in the U.S. National Library of Medicine and National Institutes of Health called, quote, Episodes of Mass Hysteria in African Schools. Very specific. A very specific study that examines real examples of mass hysteria among school children in Africa. And in this report, the 94 Zimbabwe UFO incident is mentioned. It says this. Virtually every single one of the 62 children iterated this exact same story with same details, and none of them had gone against his or her story. Many dismissed the 94 incident as mass hysteria affecting the children. But when the children were found to not have much prior knowledge to UFOs or popular UFO perceptions, many other people believed that what the children witnessed could have been real. In a actually published National Institute of Health study on mass hysteria, it was the one case in all of their cases where they couldn't definitively say it was mass hysteria. What's your reaction?
Well, it's great because this is exactly the sort of body you would expect to say, we are skeptical and this is a great example. But they say exactly the opposite. Like, yeah, this is what hysteria is, but we think the school, something else happened.
So an official study about mass hysteria couldn't definitively say that what happened at this school with these children and this UFO sighting was mass hysteria. Now, I don't want to go too further with the Zimbabwe story, and I would advise anyone else to dive in themselves. Suffice to say that it's a very fascinating case, in my opinion. We're going to end with one of the most famous stories of a close encounter, which is the Betty and Barney Hill story, which, if you know anything about UFOs, you're already familiar about, but I think, they deserve a big spot at the top when it comes to close encounters. Tell me about Betty and Barney Hill.
Well, this is a classic case from 1961. Betty and Barney Hill are driving home late at night. They see a UFO. Then they actually see entities. And so we have close encounter of the third kind. But it gets better. They claim they are taken on board this craft and procedures are carried out on them. So effectively it moves from a close encounter of the third kind to a close encounter of the fourth kind, which we now know as an alien abduction.
And on the next episode, we will be diving deep into the phenomenon known as alien abduction.